He denied her before she could even speak her first word. 21 years later, she stood in court, not as his daughter, but as the judge who would decide his future. And he had no idea who she was. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe for more just like it. The fluorescent lights above the courtroom hallway buzzed softly, throwing a pale glow over the worn-out floor tiles. Alina stood near the vending machine, her arms wrapped around a small bundle tucked in a faded pink blanket. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, but her eyes were fixed on the tall man just a few steps away. Faraz was adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, checking his watch like he had more important places to be. He didn't look at her. Not once. Alina stepped forward, blocking his path. Her voice was low but steady. "Faraz, she's yours." He froze for half a second before turning his head slightly, eyes scanning the baby in her arms with cold disinterest. His jaw clenched, but his tone stayed calm, like he had rehearsed it. "I told you before. I'm married. I have a life. I can't deal with this mess." Alina's hands tightened around the baby. "She's not a mess. She's a child." Your child." Faraz pulled an envelope from inside his coat and held it out toward her. "Take this. It's more than enough. You can sort out your own life." Alina stared at the envelope but didn't reach for it. "I don't want your money. I want you to take responsibility." He let out a dry laugh. "Responsibility? I never asked for this. You brought this on yourself. And if you think you can use her to squeeze anything from me, forget it." "I'm not asking for anything," she whispered. "I just thought you had the decency to care." Faraz stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "Listen to me carefully. If you try to contact my family, my office, or speak to anyone about this, I'll destroy you, quietly. No one will believe you. You'll be left with nothing." Alina's chest tightened. Her eyes welled, but no tears fell. She stared at him, trying to see even a flicker of the man he once pretended to be. There was nothing, just a hollow shell in a suit, walking away like she was no more than a stranger. She stood still for a long time after he left, holding her daughter close as people rushed past without noticing her. Then she stepped out of the courthouse into the cold wind, her coat barely holding back the chill. Cars moved, horns blared, city lights blinked around her, but everything felt quiet inside. She kissed her baby's forehead. "We'll make it," she whispered. "He doesn't matter. We'll make it." 21 years later, Mahira walked down a quiet hallway, lined with glass panels and old portraits. Her black robe flowed gently behind her, her heels tapping against the polished floor. Everything about her was composed. The sharp collar of her robe, the tight bun in her hair, the measured steps. But inside, her heart was pushing against her ribs. She had been assigned a high-profile corruption case, a major trial, corporate fraud, witness threats, bribery, the kind of case that made headlines and broke careers. But that wasn't why her chest was tight. It was the name printed in bold on the top of the case file. Faraz Hashmi. Mahira had read it twice, 3 times. Her hand had trembled just slightly before she closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. She hadn't seen his face in 2 decades. She didn't remember his voice, only the pieces her mother had never spoken about. When she turned 18, Mahira had searched old court records, chased fragments of a story no one wanted to tell. And then she found it. A name buried in a paternity filing that went nowhere. No follow-up, no support, just silence. Now that name was back. This time not as a father, but as a criminal. And she was the one assigned to judge him. As she neared the courtroom, her assistant Rafi walked beside her, speaking quickly about press presence, pretrial notes, and a few documents that had arrived late. Mahira nodded, saying little. Rafi didn't notice her silence. He was used to her calm, the way she held everything in. But this time was different. This time the past was sitting on the other side of the bench. Inside the courtroom, the buzz of whispered conversations filled the air. Journalists shifted in their seats, adjusting cameras and notepads. Lawyers paced quietly, exchanging tense glances. It was the first hearing of what many were calling the most significant white-collar crime case of the year. Mahira sat behind the bench, her face unreadable. Her eyes scanned the file once more, even though she already knew every detail by heart. Her fingers rested lightly on the wooden desk in front of her. She had always been known for her focus, her balance, her ability to remain untouched by emotions in the courtroom. But today her thoughts didn't just belong to the law. They were split in two, half buried in a case file, half in a memory that had never quite faded. The courtroom doors opened. Faraz Hashmi entered with slow, steady steps. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his suit perfectly tailored. He looked calm, even confident, like a man who had spent a lifetime knowing how to control rooms like this. Mahira watched him closely. He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. Why would he? He had only glanced at her once, 21 years ago, wrapped in a blanket, too young to even understand what had happened outside that courtroom hallway. But she remembered. Or rather, she remembered the absence of him, the silence in every birthday, the missing seat at every school event, the nights her mother worked double shifts while she heated leftover rice and waited. Faraz sat down at the defense table beside his lawyers. One of them leaned over and whispered something. He nodded, eyes focused ahead, completely unaware that the judge sitting in front of him was the daughter he had denied. The prosecutor stood and began reading the charges. Bribery, fraud, falsifying legal documents, paying off witnesses. Faraz listened without expression, like he'd heard worse before. Maybe he had. His face didn't twitch once. Mahira gave no sign of emotion. She nodded at the prosecutor, then turned to the defense. Does the defendant understand the charges? Faraz stood, fixing the collar of his jacket. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. Their eyes met for the first time. Mahira didn't blink. Her voice didn't shake. Very well, let's begin. Faraz sat down again, turning slightly toward his lawyer. If he noticed anything familiar in her face, he gave no sign. Mahira's expression remained steady, but her heart was pushing against her chest harder now. She had spent her whole life preparing to stand in rooms like this. But not for this, not for him, and yet here they were, finally in the same room again. Only this time, she held the gavel. The trial began with procedural formalities, but Mahira barely heard them. Her ears caught every word, but her mind moved beneath the surface, calculating, watching, studying him. Faraz sat tall, his hands folded neatly on the table, his jaw set like stone. He whispered now and then to his lead attorney, a man named Nadim, who had the slick confidence of someone used to winning dirty. They both looked too sure, too practiced, like this was just another performance. Mahira watched the room, letting her gaze linger on small details. The nervous intern fumbling with a stack of exhibits. The reporter scribbling with one hand while holding a phone with the other. Her eyes stopped briefly on a woman in the back row, older, wearing a modest cotton shawl, fingers laced tightly in her lap. It was her mother. Alina had slipped in quietly, sitting alone in the back, avoiding attention. She hadn't told Mahira she was coming. She didn't need to. Mahira had known the moment she saw the name on the case that her mother would want to see it for herself. She turned her focus back to the hearing. The prosecution began calling witnesses, accountants, former employees, anonymous whistleblowers, all pointing toward the same thing. Years of corruption buried beneath layers of forged documents and bribes. Faraz had built his wealth on ruined lives and broken contracts, and now the paper trail was laid out for all to see. But still, he showed no sign of fear. Nadim handled cross-examinations like a showman. He raised doubts, twisted statements, planted uncertainty without ever breaking the rules. Mahira watched him carefully, noting every tactic. He was good, too good, the kind of lawyer who didn't care what was true, only what worked. During a short break, Mahira returned to her chamber. She locked the door behind her and stood by the window, staring at the street below. She could feel her hands tightening into fists. For years, she had imagined what she would say if she ever saw Faraz again. 1,000 lines, 100 moments. But now that he was here, alive, smug, breathing the same air, there was no space for those thoughts. Only the trial, only justice. There would be time for the truth later. For now, she would wait. Let him stay blind. Let him believe this was just another courtroom. Let him believe she was just another judge. The next day, the courtroom was packed. News of the trial had spread fast. Cameras hovered outside the building, microphones waiting for statements that hadn't been made yet. Inside, the air was tighter, every chair filled, every glance sharp. But Mahira's focus was clear. Her expression was still. She didn't allow herself to show anything. Not yet. The prosecution continued presenting its case. They brought in an IT specialist who had uncovered hidden transactions linked to a shell company under Faraz's control. A financial analyst followed, showing how money had moved quietly from one fake account to another. Faraz sat there untouched, like the case had nothing to do with him. Even when the numbers were read aloud, even when a former client claimed she was threatened into silence, his face stayed calm. But Mahira saw something shift when the name Bashir and Khan Developers was mentioned. Just for a second, his eyes twitched. His fingers pressed together more tightly. It was the only crack in his mask. She marked it in her mind. After the witness was dismissed, Nadim stood and requested a private motion to discuss the admissibility of certain evidence. Mahira agreed and called for a short recess. As the courtroom emptied, Faraz remained seated at the table, flipping slowly through a folder like nothing concerned him. Mahira rose and stepped toward her chambers, but her eyes met her mother's again. Alina had returned to the same seat as the day before, quiet and composed. But Mahira saw the way her hands shook slightly, the way her mouth stayed tight, pressed together like she was holding something back. Mahira paused. For a moment she thought about walking to her, sitting down, saying something. But then the bailiff called her name, and the moment passed. Inside her chambers, she took off her robe and sat on the edge of the desk. Her fingers traced the smooth wooden surface, but her thoughts were sharp. She remembered a night from her childhood. She was 10. She had asked her mother why she didn't have a father like the other kids in school. Alina had gone quiet. Then she said, "Some men are born with power but no soul. You learn to live without them." At the time, Mahira hadn't understood what that meant. Now she did. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled, and reached for the motion file. It was just another legal form, filled with strategy and technical language. But every page brought her closer to the moment she was waiting for. The moment Faraz would look at her, not as a judge, but as the daughter he abandoned. The third day of the trial brought more than just evidence. It brought tension that moved like heat through the room. Whispers passed between rows, reporters scribbled faster, and even the jury seemed more alert, their eyes darting between the lawyers and the man on trial. Faraz entered with the same slow confidence, flanked by Nadim and another junior lawyer. His suit was navy today, polished, perfect. He smiled politely to the courtroom staff, as if he were attending a seminar, not facing the collapse of his reputation. Mahira didn't flinch when he looked her way. She kept her posture straight, her expression composed. But inside, her breath had slowed to a cold, steady rhythm. She couldn't afford to blink. Today, the prosecution had brought in a surprise. A woman named Zoya, a former contractor who had worked under a firm connected to Faraz's web of companies. She wasn't scheduled until later in the trial, but her testimony had suddenly become urgent. The prosecution said they had received new evidence just 2 nights ago. A phone recording, a conversation between Faraz and a former business partner, Zoya's former employer, where they discussed shifting blame onto smaller names in case of an investigation. Zoya took the stand, nervous but determined. Her hands trembled as she held the printed transcript of the call, but her voice didn't crack. She read the words carefully, sentence by sentence. Faraz's voice on the recording was calm, measured, and unmistakable. "If anyone talks, we say it was the contractor. Nobody checks those people anyway." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Mahira looked over the transcript quickly. The date on the file matched with the contract Zoya had signed. It was all connected. She lifted her eyes to Faraz. He had gone still. No shifting. No folder flipping this time. His jaw was tight, and his hand gripped the edge of the table. Nadim objected to the sudden presentation of the recording, arguing it was an unfair ambush, but Mahira overruled it. The rules had been followed. The witness had been notified, evidence had been submitted, everything was in order. Zoya continued. She spoke about how she had once admired Faraz from a distance, thought of him as a success story, until the day her boss blamed her for financial mismanagement she had no part in. She had lost her job, her savings, and had been struggling for years. When she heard the recording from a former colleague, she came forward. "He said no one checks people like me," she said, her voice firm now. "But I'm not invisible. I'm not disposable." The courtroom was silent for a moment after she stepped down. The prosecution rested for the day. Mahira called for a recess. She stood and walked back to her chambers, the silence around her louder than the noise. Once the door closed behind her, she leaned against it for a long moment. The arrogance, the control, the ease with which Faraz had destroyed lives without blinking. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the pattern, the way he used people, erased them, and moved on like nothing happened. She sat at her desk, eyes locked on a framed photo in the corner. It was old, slightly faded, a teenage Mahira in a black school uniform, holding a cheap trophy in one hand. Her mother beside her, arms wrapped tightly around her, smiling despite the tiredness in her eyes. Alina had never told her daughter the full story, but Mahira knew enough. She had learned the rest on her own. The denial, the silence, the courtroom hallway, where everything was cut off before it began. Now that man was sitting just a few feet away, facing everything he thought he had escaped. Mahira reached for the trial folder again. Tomorrow would begin the defense's case. Nadim would try to poke holes in every testimony, turn doubt into strategy. That was his job. But there was one thing he couldn't control: what Faraz would see when he finally realized who was sitting on that bench. Mahira didn't know what he'd do when it hit him, but she would be ready. The next morning arrived with a heavy sky outside the courthouse, clouds pressing low, as if the air itself carried the weight of everything waiting to unfold. Inside, the courtroom was even more crowded than the day before. More journalists, more observers. Whispers spread through the rows about the new evidence, about the voice recording, about the woman who had refused to stay silent. Faraz walked in slower than usual. His shoulders weren't as relaxed. His eyes scanned the room more carefully this time, pausing briefly when he noticed Alina sitting in the back. His eyes narrowed. He looked at her like a face he couldn't quite place. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. Mahira noticed everything from the bench. Faraz didn't know yet, but something in him was beginning to stir. The defense opened their case with a witness who was once Faraz's senior financial advisor, a man named Saeed. His job was clear: to cast doubt. He explained complex transactions, used phrases like miscommunication between departments, and no direct evidence linking the client personally. Saeed was calm, confident, and careful with every word. Nadim asked the right questions to make him appear honest and controlled. Mahira let him speak. Then the cross-examination began. The prosecutor stepped forward, holding the same documents Saeed had reviewed, and began asking about specific transfers, one by one, date by date. At first, Saeed answered smoothly, but then he hesitated. One of the accounts he claimed not to remember. Another, he said, was created after he had left the company. But the dates didn't match. The evidence showed his name attached to approvals 2 weeks after he claimed he had resigned. Mahira watched the tension build. Faraz leaned in and whispered something to Nadim. The defense shifted tactics. Nadim requested that Saeed be excused early, claiming his memory had been impacted by a recent illness, and that his medical records could confirm this. The judge raised an eyebrow, but allowed the request, for now. As the courtroom emptied for the midday break, Faraz remained seated at the table. He looked again toward the back row. This time he stared longer at Alina. Her head was bowed slightly, her hands clasped in her lap. A nurse's ID badge still hung from her purse. She looked like a tired woman passing through. But something about her face held him there. He whispered, "That woman. She looks familiar." Mahira didn't flinch, but inside something twisted. Back in chambers, she stood alone at the window, watching the gray clouds gather outside. Her assistant Rafi brought her lunch, but she barely touched it. She stood there for a long time, the city passing beneath her like it had always done, unbothered, unaware of the histories being replayed behind closed doors. Her mind wasn't just on Faraz now, it was on her mother, on the quiet strength it took to sit in that room, day after day, knowing the man who had ruined her life didn't even recognize her. Mahira stepped away from the window and walked to her desk. She pulled out a file from the bottom drawer. Not part of the court records, not evidence, Just a worn, folded document. Her birth certificate. Father. Not listed. She had read that line so many times over the years. It used to sting. Now it felt like a badge. Proof of what her mother had endured and still survived. The trial would continue in 1 hour. Faraz would take the stand soon. Nadim would coach him through it, keep the lies smooth, keep the face calm. But there was one thing no lawyer could prepare him for. The truth he hadn't seen yet. And it was coming. The courtroom filled again after the break. But now the energy had shifted. Everyone sensed that something was building. The press had taken over the first 3 rows. Even junior staff from other departments had snuck in quietly to witness the next phase of the trial. There was something in the air, an invisible tension that tightened as the bailiff called the court to order. Faraz was about to testify. It was a move that surprised many. Defendants in high-stakes cases like this often avoided the stand, hiding behind their lawyers and legal tricks. But Faraz had chosen otherwise. Maybe it was arrogance. Maybe he truly believed he could talk his way out of anything. After all, he had done it his whole life. He adjusted his tie as he walked up to the witness box, moving like a man still in control. Nadim followed closely, offering a brief nod before beginning the direct examination. The questions started simple: his career history, the companies he founded, the awards he had received. He spoke clearly, carefully. His voice was smooth, practiced. He didn't stumble. When asked about the fraud allegations, he explained them away as oversights, errors in delegation, and external misunderstandings. He blamed lower-level employees for poor communication. He avoided anything that would tie him directly to the crimes. He smiled once or twice, even joked lightly about the stress of running a business in a difficult economy. The jury listened, some with narrowed eyes, some with furrowed brows, but no one looked more still than Mahira. Her gaze didn't leave his face, not even once. Then the moment came. Nadim stepped aside. The prosecutor rose and walked slowly to the witness stand. "What is your policy, Mr. Hashmi, when it comes to taking responsibility for your company's decisions?" Faraz folded his hands. "I believe in leadership. I believe in guiding others. But I also believe that mistakes should be owned by those who make them." Mahira blinked slowly. "And when those mistakes come from the top?" The prosecutor pressed. "I always handle my own affairs with honesty," Faraz said, his voice steady. "If I had done something wrong, I would admit it, but I haven't." There it was, the lie. Mahira leaned back slightly, fingers resting against the bench. She could hear her mother's voice in her memory, soft, tired, from all those years ago. "He looked me in the eyes and lied like it meant nothing." The prosecutor paused, then opened a file. "I'd like to ask you about a different matter, something personal." Nadim immediately stood. "Objection? Irrelevant." The prosecutor held up a document. "Your Honor, this ties directly into the defendant's character. It reflects on his pattern of denial and personal responsibility." Mahira paused. Her silence held the room. Then with a firm tone she answered, "Overruled. Proceed." Faraz shifted slightly in his seat. The prosecutor walked to the center of the courtroom. "Mr. Hashmi, in April 22 years ago, were you involved in a legal matter outside this courthouse involving a woman named Alina Qureshi?" Faraz blinked. A long pause followed. "I don't recall anything specific. She claimed you fathered a child with her. Do you deny that?" Nadim stood again. "Objection. Your Honor, this is clearly a personal attack." Mahira raised a hand. "The witness may answer." Faraz cleared his throat. "Yes, I deny that. That woman tried to frame me. I gave a statement at the time, and it was handled." "You gave her money, didn't you?" "I handled it. Quietly. She disappeared." Mahira felt the air leave the room for a second. Disappeared. That was what he had called it. The mother who raised her through hunger, sacrifice, and silence, reduced to a problem he believed was solved with an envelope. The prosecutor stared at him. "Did you ever confirm the child's paternity?" "There was no need," Faraz said. "It was clear she was trying to trap me." A ripple passed through the jury. Mahira felt her chest tighten, but she kept her voice calm. "Court will break for the day," she said. "We resume tomorrow morning." The gavel came down. Faraz stepped down from the stand slowly. As he turned toward the defense table, his eyes briefly passed over Alina again. This time he paused. He stared longer. A flicker of something passed across his face. Not recognition, yet, but discomfort, like a shadow he couldn't quite place. Alina stood slowly and walked out. Mahira remained seated, eyes forward, lips pressed together. Her hands stayed folded. She waited for the room to empty. Then quietly she whispered to herself, "He still doesn't know." But he would. And when he did, it wouldn't be in a whisper. It would be a sentence. The sky outside was a bruised gray when the next morning arrived. The courthouse steps were already crowded before the first staff member unlocked the front doors. Reporters stood under umbrellas, their microphones covered in plastic, voices raised over the patter of rain. It was clear now that this wasn't just a legal case anymore. It was a public spectacle. The headlines had changed tone overnight. Corporate giant faces downfall. Even junior staff from other departments had snuck in quietly to witness the next phase of the trial. There was something in the air, an invisible tension that tightened as the bailiff called the court to order. Faraz was about to testify. It was a move that surprised many. Defendants in high-stakes cases like this often avoided the stand, hiding behind their lawyers and legal tricks. But Faraz had chosen otherwise. Maybe it was arrogance. Maybe he truly believed he could talk his way out of anything. After all, he had done it his whole life. He adjusted his tie as he walked up to the witness box, moving like a man still in control. Nadim followed closely, offering a brief nod before beginning the direct examination. The questions started simple: his career history, the companies he founded, the awards he had received. He spoke clearly, carefully. His voice was smooth, practiced. He didn't stumble. When asked about the fraud allegations, he explained them away as oversights, errors in delegation, and external misunderstandings. He blamed lower-level employees for poor communication. He avoided anything that would tie him directly to the crimes. He smiled once or twice, even joked lightly about the stress of running a business in a difficult economy. The jury listened, some with narrowed eyes, some with furrowed brows. But no one looked more still than Mahira. Her gaze didn't leave his face, not even once. Then the moment came. Nadim stepped aside. The prosecutor rose and walked slowly to the witness stand. "What is your policy, Mr. Hashmi, when it comes to taking responsibility for your company's decisions?" Faraz folded his hands. "I believe in leadership. I believe in guiding others. But I also believe that mistakes should be owned by those who make them." Mahira blinked slowly. "And when those mistakes come from the top?" The prosecutor pressed. "I always handle my own affairs with honesty," Faraz said, his voice steady. "If I had done something wrong, I would admit it, but I haven't." There it was. The lie. Mahira leaned back slightly, fingers resting against the bench. She could hear her mother's voice in her memory, soft, tired from all those years ago. "He looked me in the eyes and lied like it meant nothing." The prosecutor paused, then opened a file. "I'd like to ask you about a different matter. Something personal." Nadim immediately stood. "Objection. Irrelevant." The prosecutor held up a document. "Your Honor, this ties directly into the defendant's character. It reflects on his pattern of denial and personal responsibility." Mahira paused. Her silence held the room. Then with a firm tone she answered, "Overruled." "Proceed." Faraz shifted slightly in his seat. The prosecutor walked to the center of the courtroom. "Mr. Hashmi, in April 22 years ago, were you involved in a legal matter outside this courthouse involving a woman named Alina Qureshi?" Faraz blinked. A long pause followed. "I don't recall anything specific. She claimed you fathered a child with her. Do you deny that?" Nadim stood again. "Objection. Your Honor, this is clearly a personal attack." Mahira raised a hand. "The witness may answer." Faraz cleared his throat. "Yes, I deny that. That woman tried to frame me. I gave a statement at the time and it was handled." "You gave her money, didn't you?" "I handled it. Quietly. She disappeared." Mahira felt the air leave the room for a second. Disappeared. That was what he had called it. The mother who raised her through hunger, sacrifice, and silence, reduced to a problem he believed was solved with an envelope. The prosecutor stared at him. "Did you ever confirm the child's paternity?" "There was no need," Faraz said. "It was clear she was trying to trap me." A ripple passed through the jury. Mahira felt her chest tighten, but she kept her voice calm. "Court will break for the day," she said. "We resume tomorrow morning." The gavel came down. Faraz stepped down from the stand slowly. As he turned toward the defense table, his eyes briefly passed over Alina again. This time, he paused. He stared longer. A flicker of something passed across his face. Not recognition, yet, but discomfort, like a shadow he couldn't quite place. Alina stood slowly and walked out. Mahira remained seated, eyes forward, lips pressed together. Her hands stayed folded. She waited for the room to empty. Then quietly she whispered to herself, "He still doesn't know." But he would. And when he did, it wouldn't be in a whisper. It would be a sentence. The sky outside was a bruised gray when the next morning arrived. The courthouse steps were already crowded before the first staff member unlocked the front doors. Reporters stood under umbrellas, their microphones covered in plastic, voices raised over the patter of rain. It was clear now that this wasn't just a legal case anymore. It was a public spectacle. The headlines had changed tone overnight. Corporate giant faces downfall. Hidden past emerges in courtroom drama. Inside her chambers, Mahira stared at the steaming mug of tea on her desk. She hadn't touched it. Sleep had been thin the night before, stolen in short waves between long hours of thought. Her mother hadn't called. Neither had she. There were no words to exchange right now. Everything between them sat in the silence. 21 years of unspoken truths, now beginning to shake the walls of the very courtroom they had once stood outside as forgotten strangers. She turned away from the desk and moved toward the small mirror on the wall. Her face looked tired, not broken, just worn. She adjusted her collar, pulled her robe over her shoulders, and straightened her spine. No one would see anything different today. She would give them the same composed judge she'd always been. But today was different, because today she was going to make him see. By the time she entered the courtroom, Faraz was already seated. He didn't look as polished as the days before. His tie was slightly crooked. His eyes were red, like sleep hadn't come easily to him either. Alina wasn't in the room yet. Mahira noticed that too. The session began with a short legal motion, some attempt by the defense to limit the scope of the personal questions brought up the day before. Mahira denied it without hesitation. Then came the moment she had waited for. She leaned slightly forward, addressing the courtroom. "Before we move to closing arguments," she said, her tone even, "I will allow one final round of clarification from both sides. Short, precise." The prosecutor nodded and stood, holding a paper in one hand. "We request clarification on the character of the defendant, specifically his response to allegations made in connection to a paternity denial involving Ms. Alina Qureshi Faraz shifted." He didn't look surprised this time, just annoyed. "We've already discussed that," he said, a faint edge in his voice. "It was settled privately. It has nothing to do with this case." Mahira looked down for a moment, then returned her eyes to him. "You testified yesterday that the woman disappeared, that you handled it." "Yes," Faraz said. "She tried to use the child against me. I paid her to leave." "She did. You never confirmed if the child was yours?" "There was no need." "And if that child had grown up and was in this room today, would you recognize her?" Faraz blinked. He stared at her now, confused. No, I wouldn't." Mahira nodded slightly, then picked up a paper from her bench. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't official. It was a copy of that same worn document, the one that had followed her silently her entire life. 21 years ago, Alina Qureshi gave birth to a daughter. The father was not listed. The case was dropped after you denied responsibility, Mr. Hashmi. You've stood by that denial. "I did what I had to do," Faraz said, sitting up straighter. "It wasn't true." Mahira held the silence for a beat. Then she leaned slightly forward. "Her name is Mahira Qureshi Hashmi." Faraz's face lost color. The room didn't breathe. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand or move. She just looked at him, calm, steady, as if she were reading out the time. "I am that child," she said. Gasps rose in waves across the courtroom. Reporters dropped pens. The sound of camera shutters clicking was immediate. Even the jury was frozen. Faraz opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Mahira didn't blink. "You denied me. You denied my mother." You erased us to protect your comfort, your name, your image. You told the world we didn't matter." She paused, letting the words sit in the open air. "But we're still here." Faraz was staring at her, eyes wide, chest rising unevenly. His mouth opened again, then closed. He looked at Nadim, then back at her, then at the floor, like something inside him had cracked in half. Mahira turned back to the bench. Her voice returned to its firm, professional rhythm. "The court will now recess for 10 minutes before we proceed to closing arguments." She stood, nodded to the bailiff, and stepped out through the judge's door, leaving behind a courtroom stunned into silence. Behind the heavy door, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Not in pain, not in regret, but in quiet, solid release. He had seen her. Finally. The hallway outside her chambers was silent. The noise from the courtroom, the gasps, the camera shutters, the whispers, it all felt distant now, as if behind a thick wall of glass. Mahira stood still for a long time, her hands resting at her sides, her back pressed gently against the cold wall. Her breath was steady, her mind strangely calm. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways: rage, confrontation, breakdown. But what had happened just now was quieter, sharper, like a needle, not a hammer. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. The truth had done its own work. Inside the courtroom, Faraz sat slumped in his chair, his face pale, his hands twitching at the edge of the table. The silence he used to control people had turned against him now. He was no longer the one watching the room. Now the room was watching him. Nadim leaned toward him, whispering rapidly, trying to refocus him before closing arguments began. But Faraz didn't respond. He kept glancing toward the judge's bench as if hoping Mahira would walk back out and say it was all a mistake. But it wasn't. She was real. The daughter he had erased had grown into the woman now weighing the evidence that would decide his fate. 10 minutes passed, but the stillness in the courtroom didn't lift. The bailiff called for order as Mahira returned. This time no one whispered. No one shifted. They all watched her with a kind of reverence now. Something had changed, not just in the trial, but in the air, in the atmosphere. The balance of power had shifted. She took her seat, her face composed once again. If there was any emotion underneath, she hid it with the same poise she had always worn. "Proceed with closing arguments," she said. The prosecutor stood first. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't dramatize. He simply walked through the facts one step at a time. The transactions, the accounts, the fake companies, the manipulated contracts, then the human cost, Zoya, the whistleblowers, the partners left in ruin while Faraz flourished, and finally the character of the man behind it all. "This is not a man who made a single mistake," the prosecutor said, walking slowly before the jury. "This is a man who made a career out of stepping on people, who thought power meant protection, who thought that denial was a shield he could hide behind." He glanced briefly at the bench, then back at the jury. "But truth does not disappear just because someone refuses to see it. Today the truth is no longer hiding." When he finished, the courtroom was still. Nadim rose next. His voice was calm, but it lacked the smooth edge it had carried earlier in the trial. There was a stiffness in his posture, a slight tremble in his voice that hadn't been there before. "My client has served his community. He has built companies, created jobs. He is not perfect, but who among us is?" He avoided all mention of Mahira. He didn't dare address what had just been revealed. He tried to steer the jury's attention back to the numbers, the paperwork, the legal definitions. But no one was really listening anymore. The defense had lost its weight. When the arguments ended, Mahira instructed the jury on deliberations, then adjourned the court. The jury would return the next day with their verdict. Until then, the room emptied slowly, filled with low murmurs and stunned expressions. Faraz remained seated at the defense table long after most people had left. His fingers trembled slightly as he gathered the papers in front of him. He glanced once more toward the bench. Mahira was gone. Back in her chambers, Mahira sat quietly, staring at the wall in front of her. Her robe hung loosely now, the weight of it less important than the silence she finally allowed herself to feel. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just sat there. Her father had finally seen her, not as a mistake, not as a threat, but as the one thing he never expected: judgment. The next morning the sky had cleared, but the air was sharp. Cold crept in through the cracks around the old courthouse windows, as if the building itself had absorbed the tension from the trial. People gathered early, forming quiet lines outside the courtroom doors. Some came for the legal outcome, others for the drama that had swept headlines overnight. Judge reveals she is defendant's daughter during live trial. It was everywhere. News anchors argued about ethics, social media exploded with clips, and everyone had an opinion. But Mahira stayed untouched by the noise. She entered through the back entrance that morning, avoiding the crowd, walking with the same steady pace, same quiet resolve. Inside her chambers, she sat alone before the jury returned. She hadn't spoken to Alina since the day before. She hadn't needed to. Her mother's silence in the courtroom had said everything. There was no anger, no regret, only strength. The jury returned just after 10 a.m., their faces serious, tired, but focused. The courtroom filled quickly. Faraz arrived last. He looked like he hadn't slept. His shirt was wrinkled under the jacket. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his collar. He didn't look at the press. He didn't even look at his lawyer. He only looked at the judge's bench, at her. Mahira didn't return the gaze. She kept her eyes on the jury, her voice clear. Has the jury reached a verdict? A middle-aged woman stood slowly, holding a folded sheet of paper in both hands. We have, Your Honor. The bailiff took the paper and brought it forward. Mahira unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the words. No expression crossed her face. She nodded once, passed it back to the clerk, and turned to the courtroom. In the matter of the people versus Faraz Hashmi, she began, her voice steady, on the count of corporate fraud, guilty. On the count of witness tampering, guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, guilty. The air in the room cracked open. No one moved, but the silence was thunderous. Faraz didn't react at first. His eyes were wide but blank, like the words hadn't reached him. He looked to Nadim, but the lawyer's head was bowed, his hand covering his mouth. There was nothing to say now. No more papers to wave, no more distractions, only truth. Mahira looked down for a moment, then turned her gaze back to Faraz. Her tone didn't change. It was still professional, still even, but this time it carried something deeper, a final weight. You built your world on silence, on names erased, on doors closed behind you. You believed that if something was hidden long enough, it stopped existing. But silence is not justice, and time does not protect the guilty. She paused. You didn't just lie. You erased people. You called them mistakes. You left them behind as if they were nothing. Now she looked directly at him. Her eyes met his and didn't move. But they were everything. Faraz didn't look away. He couldn't. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. You will be sentenced according to the maximum allowed under the law, she continued, turning back to the bench. This court is adjourned. She stood, her robe swaying as she moved toward the door. The gavel struck once, final, sharp, loud. As she exited, the courtroom remained still. No one stood. No one clapped. Not even the press dared speak. It wasn't just a verdict that had landed. It was the end of a man's myth. Back in her chambers, Mahira removed her robe and hung it carefully. She sat on the edge of her chair, staring at her reflection in the glass pane of the cabinet across the room. She didn't feel triumph. That was never the goal. She felt clean. He had finally faced the truth. In front of everyone. Not with yelling, not with scandal, but with the one thing he couldn't escape. Her. A knock came at the door. Software. Familiar. She stood and opened it. Alina stood there, her eyes full but calm. She didn't speak at first. Neither did Mahira. Then quietly Alina said, He saw you. Mahira nodded. I saw him too. And for the first time in a very long time, they both smiled. Not because justice had finally come, but because they had survived long enough to watch it happen. That night the city buzzed with noise, but Mahira's apartment was silent. The soft hum of traffic below filtered through the windows, and faint lights from distant buildings blinked through the sheer curtains. She sat on the edge of her sofa, barefoot, still in her work clothes. Her blazer hung off one arm, and a cold cup of tea sat untouched on the table beside her. Her phone had buzzed nonstop since the verdict. Messages from journalists, former classmates, law school professors, even strangers. Some were praising her, some were questioning the ethics. Others just wanted a comment. She hadn't answered any of them. She didn't need the world's approval. The weight that had sat inside her for over 2 decades had shifted. Not vanished, not erased, but changed. It was no longer a quiet burden pressed against her ribs. Now it was a scar, visible, known, and no longer whispered about in the dark corners of memory. Her doorbell rang once. She stood slowly, walked barefoot across the wooden floor, and opened the door. Elena stood there, holding a plastic container of biryani in one hand and a small bag of oranges in the other. Her eyes were tired, but there was a quiet ease in her face that hadn't been there in years. "I thought you might not have eaten," she said simply. Mahira stepped aside without a word. Alina entered like she had 100 times before, like the years hadn't hardened either of them. She placed the food on the table, then sat on the couch, hands resting in her lap. Mahira sat across from her. They sat in silence for a while, both women staring at the soft yellow glow of the lamp in the corner. Finally, Alina broke the stillness. "I watched him today," she said softly, "from the back row. He didn't understand anything until it was too late." Mahira nodded. "That was the point." Alina looked down at her hands. "I used to think about this moment all the time. What I would say if I ever saw him again. How I would tell him what he did to us. What he took. But when it happened, I didn't want to speak at all." Mahira leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "You didn't need to. You already said everything. With the way you lived. With what you gave me." A small smile tugged at Alina's mouth, but her eyes were wet. She blinked quickly. "I didn't know if I made the right choices," she admitted. "Raising you without his name. Keeping it from you. I was scared you'd hate me for it." "I didn't hate you," Mahira said gently. "I just needed to understand." Alina nodded. "And now?" Mahira looked at her. Really looked. The lines around her mother's mouth. The tired, calloused hands. The quiet strength in her voice, even after all these years. "Now I know you protected me from becoming like him." They fell quiet again. Not the kind of silence that weighed down a room, but one that allowed space to breathe. After a while, Alina stood and moved to the kitchen. She warmed the biryani, spooned it into 2 bowls, and set them on the table. They sat side by side, eating slowly. The rice was hot, spiced, familiar. It reminded Mahira of childhood, of simpler days when justice was just a word she read in books. Now it was something she had delivered. When the plates were cleared and the dishes stacked in the sink, Alina picked up her purse. She paused at the door, then turned back. "You know he'll try to reach you." Mahira didn't move. "He already did. A letter came to my office. His handwriting. I haven't read it." Alina's eyes tightened. "You don't have to." "I know," Mahira replied. "I might burn it, or maybe I'll keep it, frame it, put it on the wall under the title, 'Silence Can't Last Forever.'" Alina gave a tired laugh. "You always were dramatic." Mahira smiled. "You always were right." They hugged then, not tight, not desperate, just long enough. After Alina left, Mahira returned to her desk. The letter was there, untouched. White envelope, her name written in sharp black ink. She picked it up, stared at it for a long moment, then placed it inside a drawer without opening it. There was nothing in that envelope she didn't already know. Faraz's guilt had been proven in front of the law, but more importantly, it had been proven in front of the one person he couldn't lie to anymore. His daughter. Days passed, but the city didn't forget. Headlines kept cycling through news networks, blogs, radio shows. People argued about the case in cafes, over dinner tables, in law schools. Some praised Mahira as brave, calling her a symbol of strength. Others questioned the legality of a daughter presiding over her father's trial, though most agreed, ethically, she had done what many never could. She hadn't hidden. She hadn't run. She had let the law speak louder than blood. But Mahira wasn't interested in debates. She went back to work quietly, without making a single statement. She didn't sign interviews, didn't reply to emails from news channels offering airtime. She returned to her courtroom, handling new cases, her robe fitting just as it had before, except now, everyone who looked at her saw something else. They didn't just see a judge. They saw someone who had stood in front of her own pain, unflinching. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted, not in her job, in her. For years, she had lived with a name she never had. She had learned to carry absence like a second skin. Her father's shadow had followed her through every classroom, every scholarship, every courtroom, even if no one else knew it was there. It had shaped her discipline, sharpened her ambition. She had grown around the wound, never healed, just adapted. Now the shadow was gone, not forgotten, not forgiven, but no longer looming. She found herself walking slower these days, not out of fatigue, but because the urgency that had chased her for so long no longer did. She could breathe differently now. She could hear silence without the itch of buried questions. One afternoon, a letter from the Department of Justice arrived on her desk. It was brief, just a commendation for her handling of a high-profile case. There was talk of a potential federal appointment in the future, a quiet invitation to a broader role. She set the letter aside. That night, she sat on the balcony of her apartment, a cup of tea warming her hands. The city lights blinked below, restless as always. Her mother had just left after dinner. They'd spent the evening talking about normal things: grocery prices, the neighbor's new dog, an old cousin getting married late. For the first time in years, their conversation didn't dance around what had been missing. It was strange, Mahira thought, how the absence of something could take up so much space, how silence could become a second parent, and how, when that silence was finally broken, it didn't scream. It whispered, then faded. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "I know you may never read the letter, but I'm sorry, I truly am." She stared at it for a long time. There was no name, but she didn't need one. She didn't reply. Not out of anger, out of choice. She had already spoken, louder than any message ever could. He had lived his life pretending she didn't exist. She would live hers without needing him to. The next morning, she walked into her courtroom, put on her robe, and called the first case. Another file, another life, another story. But this time, her bench didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home. Weeks rolled by, and the trial of Faraz Hashmi became something the world remembered. But Mahira didn't carry with her. She let it fall into the background where it belonged. Her courtroom returned to its rhythm. Motions filed, witnesses called, cases closed. People walked in frightened and left changed. Some broke down, others stood taller. That's what courtrooms did. They revealed. They stripped everything bare. Mahira treated each case with the same care, the same calm hands, the same sharp clarity she always had. But inside her, the silence had a new shape now. Not empty, not aching, just still. There were moments, though, when memories came quietly. A father's face trying to remain proud as the world collapsed around him. Her mother's hands clutching a purse too tightly. The courtroom, breathless, as truth unfolded like a sheet finally pulled off, something rotten and buried too long. Mahira never tried to forget. That would be pointless. She didn't want to erase anything. She wanted to remember it on her own terms. Faraz was now in custody, awaiting formal sentencing. No appeals had been filed yet. His legal team had gone silent. The man who once commanded boardrooms and silenced voices with a look had vanished from the public eye. No new statements, no visitors, just a long stretch of time ahead. Alone, behind bars. And Mahira? She didn't follow the updates. She didn't care if he wrote more letters or tried to reach out through someone else. She had nothing more to say to him. Their story had ended exactly where it needed to. Not with forgiveness, not with reconciliation, but with accountability. On a Friday afternoon, as the courthouse emptied early ahead of the weekend, Mahira remained in her chambers, sorting through a case that had no media attention, no reporters waiting at the door. A tenant evicted without cause, an elderly woman pushed out of her rent-controlled apartment by a greedy developer. The kind of case that didn't make headlines but still mattered. Quiet injustice was often the deepest kind. Her assistant Rafi entered with a hesitant knock. "Judge," he said, "someone's here to see you." Mahira looked up. "Who?" Rafi shifted, unsure. He says he's your half-brother." The room went still. Mahira blinked once. She hadn't thought about him, Faraz's other child, the son he raised, the one who sat quietly at that restaurant table during the confrontation, the night the truth shattered their perfect family dinner. She stood slowly, smoothing her robe. "Send him in." Rafi stepped aside, and the young man walked in, tall, neatly dressed, maybe 25, with the same sharp jawline as his father, but the eyes were different. There was no pride in them, no arrogance, just uncertainty. He stopped a few feet from her desk. "My name's Salman," he said. "I don't want anything. I just needed to see you." Mahira studied him, his face, his posture, his voice. All of it carried weight, but not the kind that asked to be forgiven. "I remember you," she said. "From the restaurant." He nodded, looking down for a moment. "I didn't know about you. None of us did. He never said anything." "I figured," Mahira replied. Salman shifted again, glancing around the room before speaking. "I wanted to hate you after that night. Everything in our lives broke. My mom, she left him the next week, said she couldn't stay with someone who could lie like that." He paused, struggling to find the words. "But I watched the trial, every day. Not just the clips, the full footage. You didn't try to ruin him. You didn't twist anything. You let the truth stand." Mahira remained silent, letting him speak. "I just needed to say, I'm sorry for what he did to your mother, for not knowing, for benefiting from a life that never should have been his to protect." Mahira's voice was steady. "You weren't the one who lied." "No," he said quietly. "But I think we both lived inside the silence he created. I just didn't see it until it broke." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Mahira stood and walked around her desk. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer comfort. But she met his eyes and nodded once. "Thank you for coming." He nodded back. "Take care of yourself, Judge." As he turned to leave, she watched him go, not with anger, not with pain. Just a quiet awareness that the past had more than one branch, and maybe not all of them were rotten. Later that evening, as she left the courthouse, the sky had begun to glow with the orange-pink hue of a fading sun. The streets were quiet, the city settling into weekend stillness. Mahira walked with her coat wrapped tight around her hands deep in her pockets. She didn't feel heavy anymore, just steady. The truth had done what it was supposed to do. It had reached the ones who needed to hear it. And now the rest of her life was waiting. A month after the verdict, the official sentencing hearing was scheduled. It was a rainy morning again, almost identical to the day the trial began. Gray sky, slick pavement, umbrellas lining the steps of the courthouse. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was completely different. The noise was gone. The press had moved on to newer scandals. The room was only half full now, filled with a few quiet observers, legal clerks, and a handful of law students sitting in the back with notepads, scribbling observations for their criminal law essays. Faraz sat at the defense table, alone. No lawyers beside him. Nadim had withdrawn weeks ago after the final motions were denied. His suit hung looser on his body now. His posture had changed too, less straight, more slouched. The weight of everything had finally settled on his shoulders. And this time, there was no mask left to hold it up. Alina didn't attend the sentencing. She had said everything she needed to say by showing up through the entire trial, by sitting quietly in the back while the man who tried to erase her faced justice without ever being able to hide from the child he left behind. But Mahira was there. She entered through the same door she always did, her robe straight, her face calm, her presence commanding. She took her seat at the bench with her usual poise, and as the clerk read the opening statements, she looked once, briefly, at Faraz. He looked older, smaller, like time had caught up to him in fast motion. He didn't meet her eyes this time. She didn't need him to. This moment wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. The prosecution stood to speak, summarizing the severity of the crimes. Over a decade of manipulation, false documents, corporate fraud, and personal threats that ruined lives, they requested the maximum sentence, not out of spite, but because, as they said, When people with power abuse the system, they must be held to the highest standard, not the lowest. Faraz was asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. He stood slowly, cleared his throat. "I don't expect forgiveness," he began. His voice was low. "And I don't know if I even understand what I lost. I made choices to protect myself, to protect my image, my name, but I destroyed more than I can ever repair." He looked at the floor as he spoke. "I denied a child who was mine. I lied to everyone, including myself. And I see now that the cost wasn't just legal, it was human." He paused, then forced himself to look up at the bench. At her. "I see you now," he said. Mahira didn't move, didn't respond. Her face was still as glass. He sat back down. She took a breath, then spoke, her voice echoing softly in the quiet room. "This court is not here to weigh apologies. It is here to weigh justice." Her tone was measured, her gaze steady. "You were given every advantage. You chose to use it not to lift others, but to bury them. You built a career out of silence. You walked away from people, from truth, and from your own responsibility. And you did it without hesitation." She paused, her eyes resting on the case file before her. "But the truth waited. And when it came, it was not to destroy you. It was to hold you accountable." She looked up again, and this time, her voice softened. "Not out of mercy, but out of finality. You will serve 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck. No applause followed, no gasps. Just a room full of people standing slowly, filing out quietly. The sound of footsteps and shuffling paper. Normal things. Mahira didn't watch Faraz as he was escorted out. She didn't need to. The sentence wasn't a celebration. It was a line drawn in the sand. A closing of a chapter that had never begun properly. A name finally given shape, not through connection, but through confrontation. After the room cleared, Mahira returned to her chambers. She removed her robe, folded it slowly, placed it on the hook by the door. The weight of it felt lighter now. She sat for a while, hands resting in her lap, staring at the same space she had stared into so many times over the years. Back when she wondered if she'd ever meet him, if she'd ever get to ask why, if she'd ever get to be seen. Now she had her answers, and they weren't what she once needed. They were better. They were real. She reached into her drawer and took out the envelope, the letter he had sent during the trial, the one she hadn't opened. She held it in her hands, stared at her name on the front. Then she quietly tore it in half, then again, then again. She dropped the pieces into the trash without a sound. There was nothing in those pages that could match what had already been said, face to face. She had given him the only thing he had never given her, the truth. And now at last it belonged only to her. A year had passed. The courthouse stood the same, tall and quiet, its windows lined with history and whispered verdicts. The seasons had turned. Winter gave way to spring, and now early summer sunlight warmed the marble floors that once echoed with tension. Most people had forgotten the case. New scandals had taken its place, new stories, but those who were there remembered, not just the verdict, not just the man on trial. They remembered her. Mahira didn't speak of it anymore. Not to the press, not in speeches, not even with her mother. She had moved on, not as an escape, but as a choice. She had chosen not to let that name live any longer in her mouth. She didn't need to explain her strength. She had carried it, proved it, and walked past it. This morning she arrived early. The halls were still empty. The silence was peaceful now, not heavy. She carried a small file in one hand, a coffee in the other. Her routine was unchanged, but she was not the same woman from a year ago. She passed a security guard who smiled and greeted her with respect. No longer curious, no longer cautious. She nodded back, polite as always. She had earned every bit of that respect, not because of who she stood up to, but because of how she stood. Inside her chambers, the walls were as she'd left them. The law books stacked, the files arranged neatly, and one small photograph tucked on a shelf above her desk. Her and Alina, standing on the courthouse steps after that final hearing. Both of them in simple clothes, no cameras, no lights. Just two women with their arms around each other, breathing the air of something long overdue. That photo meant more than any certificate or medal ever could. There was a knock on the door. It opened gently, and Rafi entered with a familiar grin. "Morning, Judge. Today's docket is light. Only 3 hearings, all pretrial conferences. Should be a quiet one." Mahira smiled slightly, the kind of smile that only came now. Honest, unguarded. "Thank you," she replied. "That sounds perfect." He handed her the files and stepped back out. She reviewed the cases carefully, her mind fully present. Each file held someone's story, someone's fight, and she read each one with the same care she had always given. Maybe more now, because she understood in a deeper way what it meant to be unheard, to be overlooked, to be dismissed and still stand anyway. Around noon, as the last hearing ended and the courtroom emptied, Mahira walked alone to the large glass window overlooking the city. The sun painted the buildings gold, and the street below was alive with people moving, talking, living. She thought about Faraz, not often anymore, but sometimes. She wondered how much of his sentence he truly felt. If the days in prison passed slowly, or if he buried himself in denial the way he always had. She had no anger left for him, no desire for revenge. What she had now was something far more powerful. Peace. She thought of Salman once too. His visit, his apology, his quiet exit. She hadn't seen him again, but she hadn't needed to. Some bridges don't need to be crossed. Some are just better seen from a distance. And her mother. Alina still worked 3 days a week at the clinic. She still carried the same modest purse and wore the same quiet strength in her eyes. They had dinner together most weekends. Sometimes they spoke about everything. Sometimes they said nothing at all. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer heavy with unspoken pain. It was soft now. Mahira stepped away from the window, walked back to her bench and sat down. She rested her palms on the polished wood and looked around the empty courtroom. This place had once been a battlefield. Now it was a place of clarity. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the stillness. Then she whispered, not as a judge, not as a daughter, not even as someone wronged, just as herself. "We're not broken anymore." That was the real verdict. Not the years in prison, not the public headlines, not even the courtroom gasps. The real justice had come in silence, in healing, in facing a past that once tried to erase her. And now that past had no power left. She reached for a new file, a new case, another story to hear, and the door opened again. If this story touched you, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one.